The wind moved through the dry grass like a whisper from another time, carrying dust, loneliness, and the faint memory of laughter long gone. The woman stood on the edge of the forgotten property, her black dress stirring softly against the morning breeze. In her hand was a worn leather suitcase, the only thing she had brought from the life she was running from. Her eyes, hidden under the brim of a small hat, studied the shack before her, a slanted structure of sunburned logs, roof sagging under years of silence. It looked as though it had been built to hold sorrow. Maybe that was why she had chosen it. Pain needed a place to live. She no longer had the strength to carry all of hers. The old man at the town's edge had warned her not to buy it. He said no one stayed there long, that sometimes light flickered inside the shack even when the moon was dark. But she hadn't come for comfort. She'd come to disappear. The small ranch town had become too full of whispers, too full of faces that reminded her of everything she had lost. The morning she buried her husband, the preacher's wife had placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and said, "Time heals everything." But time hadn't healed hurt, had hollowed her out. Each day after his death felt like she was still waiting for a train that never came. So she left behind the house they built together, the church bells, the pity in the neighbors' eyes, and took the last of her savings to buy a piece of land no one wanted as she walked toward the shack. Her boots sank into dry earth. A grasshopper leapt at her hem. The air smelled of sage and wood rot. A thin stream of light slipped through the cracks in the log walls, as if the house itself was trying to breathe. She touched the door. It creaked open without resistance, like it had been waiting for her. Inside, dust floated in golden streaks, and the smell of old smoke lingered. A table stood tilted in the corner, one leg missing. A cracked jug, a piece of broken mirror. A few wooden pegs nailed into the wall, everything left behind by someone who once believed this could be home. She set the suitcase down and exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. The silence was deep. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unpinned her hat and placed it on the table. The air was cooler here, shaded from the sun. She could hear the faint rush of wind outside, the distant caw of a crow. For a moment she imagined her husband's voice behind her, calling her name softly like he used to when she'd wander off to the fields. But when she turned, there was nothing. Only the empty doorway and the horizon beyond it. She whispered to herself, "It'll do." It was a lie, but she needed to hear it. She would fix what she could: patch the roof, sweep the floor, make the place livable. She didn't need more than that. She only needed peace. But as she bent to open her suitcase, she felt something a pull, faint and uneasy, like she wasn't alone. She froze, listening. Nothing. Just the wind again. Still, her heart had quickened. She looked toward the window, where a sliver of shadow moved across the wall. Probably the branches outside, she told herself. Probably nothing. The days that followed were quiet, almost too quiet. She swept the dust, cleared the weeds from the porch, and patched the holes with whatever she could find. Each night, the coyotes howled in the distance, and the shack creaked as if it remembered old voices. Sometimes she thought she heard faint footsteps by the wall when she tried to sleep, but she was too tired to care. The nights stretched long and lonely, and the stars above the prairie looked colder than she remembered. By the third morning, she'd almost begun to feel something like calm. She lit a small fire in the hearth and boiled water for coffee. The smell filled the room, comforting and human. She sat by the window, writing a letter she'd never send, telling her late husband how she missed the sound of his boots on the porch, the way he'd hum when fixing the fence. The wind brushed through the cracks in the wall like a sigh, and she smiled faintly at the sound. Then, from the edge of her vision, something moved outside, a flicker near the old barn that stood behind the shack. She went still. It was faint, but real. Someone or something was there. Her first thought was that it might be a traveler or a thief. This far from town, strangers sometimes passed through looking for shelter. She reached for the small revolver she kept in her trunk, its handle cool and unfamiliar in her hand. She stepped outside quietly, the dry boards creaking under her boots. The sun was high now, and the light hit the barn's walls in broken lines. The door hung half open. A faint sound drifted from within, a shuffle, A breath. She called out softly, "Who's there?" No answer. Only the low hum of wind through the grass. She took a cautious step closer. The barn smelled of old hay and dust. The wooden boards were scarred with knife marks and burned edges, like someone had tried to survive here long before her. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light, and that's when she saw something small. Crouched in the corner, half hidden behind the shadows. For a heartbeat, she thought it was an animal. Then it turned its face toward her, and she froze. It was a child, a young boy, his hair tangled, his face streaked with dirt. His clothes were torn and old, his skin marked with sun and dust. And his eyes, dark, alert, unafraid, watched her with the stillness of someone who had learned to survive alone. He didn't speak, didn't move, only stared. Her breath caught. She lowered the gun slightly, unsure whether to speak or step back. "It's all right," she said softly, her voice shaking. "I won't hurt you. Still nothing." The boy blinked once and looked toward the back of the barn as if expecting someone else to appear. She took another step closer, slow and careful. "Are you alone?" she asked. The boy's lips parted slightly, but he didn't answer. A small feather hung from a cord around his neck, old, worn, but clearly important. She realized then what he was. His features, his hair, the faint red paint on his cheek, it wasn't just a lost child. He was Apache. Her heart pounded. Stories of raids and revenge had filled every town rumor. People still whispered about the tribes in the hills, some peaceful, some not. But this boy didn't look like a threat. He looked terrified, thin and hungry. The sight struck something deep inside her, a pain she thought she had buried. She lowered the gun completely. "You don't have to be scared," she whispered. "You're safe here." The boy's eyes flickered to her suitcase lying near the door, then back to her face. He didn't trust her, not yet. He looked ready to run. She took off her shawl, folded it, and placed it on the floor between them, like a peace offering. "You can come closer," she said quietly. "I won't tell anyone." Outside, a gust of wind slammed the barn door shut, startling them both. The boy jumped to his feet, pressing himself against the wall. She raised her hands quickly, trying to calm him. "It's just the wind," she said. But the way he looked at her, trembling, told her this was no ordinary fear. Something had happened to him before she arrived. Something that had taught him to run from people like her. As the silence stretched, she realized her life had just changed. The pain she came here to bury had found something new to hold on to. In that single moment between fear and compassion, something inside her began to stir again, a fragile sense of purpose, a quiet strength. But before she could speak again, shadow moved across the window behind her. Someone else was out there, watching, and just like that, the shack she bought to escape the world had become the place where everything she feared and everything she needed to face was waiting. The woman stood frozen by the door, the wind pressing against the walls as the barn filled with uneasy silence. Her eyes darted toward the window, but whoever had cast the shadow was gone. The boy hadn't moved from the corner, though his small chest rose and fell with frightened breaths. She turned back to him slowly, her voice steady, though her heart was racing. "It's all right," she whispered. "You're safe here." But she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. She stepped outside, scanning the tall grass that surrounded the shack and barn. The land stretched far in every direction, golden and dry, the horizon trembling under the heat. There was no movement, no horses, no dust trail, no sound of footsteps. Yet the feeling of being watched clung to her like a shadow. She stayed still for a long moment, letting the silence test her nerves, until finally she went back inside. The boy hadn't moved. He was crouched low, his arms around his knees, eyes fixed on her every step. "I'm not here to hurt you," she said again, setting down her gun on the floor between them so he could see it wasn't in her hands anymore. "Do you understand me?" He didn't reply, but his eyes softened just enough for her to notice. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small piece of bread she'd saved from the morning. "Here," she said, placing it near him. "You can eat it." For a while, nothing happened. Then, slowly, he stretched his arm forward and took it. His fingers were thin, his nails broken, his movements careful, like someone used to hiding even while eating. She watched him quietly, unsure of what to say. He couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, though his face carried an older kind of silence. Something about him reminded her of the wounded. Animals her husband used to bring home, those that had survived storms and bullets but had forgotten how to trust. She had once been the one to patch them, feed them, whisper comfort, until they believed again in safety. Now, looking at this boy, she felt that same quiet ache return to her chest. When he finished eating, she asked softly, "Were you living here before I came?" His eyes flicked toward the back wall. She noticed a pile of old blankets and dried reeds hidden there. He must have been living in the barn long before she arrived alone, surviving off whatever the land offered. But how long had he been here and why? She knew better than to ask too many questions at once. As the sun began to lower, she brought out a small lantern from her suitcase and lit it. The warm glow filled the barn, flickering across the rough walls. The boy's eyes followed the flame like he hadn't seen firelight in days. She smiled gently. "You can sleep inside the shack if you want. It's warmer there." But he shook his head, clutching the blanket to his chest. She didn't push. "All right," she said softly. "You can stay here for tonight. I'll bring you water." Back inside the shack, the woman sat by the window, her thoughts heavy. She couldn't stop wondering who the boy was, where he had come from, and whether someone might come looking for him. The nearest Apache camp was days away, and no one from town would dare approach them. If the boy was running, it meant something terrible had happened, something he was too afraid to speak of. And that shadow she had seen earlier, it couldn't have been her imagination. Someone had been out there. Night fell quietly. The stars appeared one by one above the desert, sharp and countless. She couldn't sleep. Every sound outside made her heart skip a coyote's cry, the rustle of weeds, the shifting of dry wood. Around midnight, she rose and went to check the barn. The boy was asleep in the corner, curled under his blanket, breathing steady. She smiled faintly. At least he had found a bit of rest. But as she turned to leave, she saw something scratched into the barn wall near the door. It was faint, carved long ago, a pattern of lines, circles, and symbols. She traced them with her fingers, realizing they weren't random marks. They were Apache signs, warnings, or perhaps directions. Her husband had once traded with the tribes. She remembered some of the old symbols. One meant danger. Another meant spirits. The last was the mark for death. She stepped back, a chill running through her despite the warm air. The barn had been used for something before she arrived, something she didn't yet understand. She looked once more at the sleeping boy. Who was he hiding from? What had he seen here? The next morning she woke to the sound of movement outside. For a moment she thought it was the boy, but when she opened the door, the space outside was empty. Only the tracks in the dirt told another story, fresh boot prints leading away from the barn, toward the ridge beyond the field. Her pulse quickened. She called out for the boy, rushing toward the barn. He was gone. The blanket lay crumpled, the breadcrumbs scattered. She ran to the edge of the ridge, scanning the open land. Far off, she spotted him, running through the tall grass, barefoot and fast. "Wait," she shouted, but he didn't turn. She dropped her suitcase and started after him, her skirt catching on thorns, her breath burning. When she finally reached the small ravine ahead, he had stopped on the other side, staring back at her with wide eyes. "Why did you run?" she called across the gap. "I won't send you away." He hesitated, breathing hard, and pointed toward the shack. His voice came out broken, barely a whisper. "He comes at night." Her heart turned cold. "Who?" she asked, but he was already backing away, shaking his head. "Who comes at night?" She shouted again, but he turned and disappeared into the hills. She stood there, trembling, the wind howling through the grass around her. When she returned to the shack, she found something lying on the porch, a small, carved figure made of wood, shaped like a bird. It hadn't been there before. The carving was rough but deliberate, the kind of totem the Apache sometimes left as warnings or protection charms. She picked it up slowly. Whoever the boy was, he wasn't lying. Someone or something was coming here after dark. The rest of the day she spent repairing the barn door and lighting lanterns around the property. She told herself it was just to keep away coyotes, but deep down she knew she was preparing for something else. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the land turned a deep shade of gold. The first cries of night birds echoed from the trees. She closed the windows, locked the door, and waited. The wind grew stronger after midnight. The roof groaned. Dust shifted in corners. She sat with her back to the wall, revolver in hand, watching the door. Hours passed with nothing but silence. Then just when she began to think it was all in her head, she heard it. A faint scrape against the wooden boards outside. Then another. Slow, deliberate. Someone was circling the shack. Her breath caught. She lifted the revolver, her finger trembling against the trigger. The steps stopped near the window. A shadow moved past the thin curtain. It was tall, too tall to be the boy. Then came a low sound, half whistle, half breath. She froze, staring as the shadow lingered, then vanished. For a long time, she didn't move. Her mind told her to stay inside, but her heart pushed her to no. She grabbed the lantern and stepped outside, the flame flickering wildly in the wind. The night was black, the stars faint behind drifting clouds. "Who's out there?" she called. No answer. Only the sound of dry grass bending. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw a faint glow from the barn. She turned toward it, raising the lantern higher. Through the broken slats, she saw the light of another flame flickering inside. Her chest tightened. Someone was there. She stepped forward slowly, every instinct warning her to turn back. The light inside flickered once, then went out completely. The barn fell silent again. She reached the door and pushed it open with a trembling hand. Inside, the smell of smoke hung heavy. The symbols on the wall seemed darker now, as if the fire had fed on them. And there, on the floor, where the boy had slept, was a single feather, the same kind that had hung from his necklace. The boy had been here. But he wasn't alone. She backed away slowly, her lantern shaking in her hand. The night outside felt alive, now, breathing, watching, waiting. She turned toward the shack, her heart racing, the carved bird still in her pocket. Whatever haunted this place had begun to stir again, and though she had come to this land to escape her own pain, she was beginning to realize something darker. Some sorrows don't stay buried. Some find you again, even in the silence of an abandoned shack. Morning came dry and bright, laying a thin sheet of light across the prairie and the broken roof. The woman boiled coffee on a small flame and held the cup with both hands, as if warmth could keep fear away. She kept replaying the boy's whisper from the ravine and the way the barn carried. The smell of smoke, though no fire had burned. The carved bird sat on the table between her and the window. She had the sense that what watched the shack did not care about walls or locks. It cared about who claimed the land, who was willing to stand on it when dark came down. She needed flour, nails for the roof, and a reason to look at people's faces in town. By noon she saddled the mule she had bought cheap and set off along the sandy road. The frontier air carried a bite of sage and the faint metallic taste of dust. The old American town at the river's bend looked small at first, then full of eyes once she stepped onto its boards. A stagecoach rattled past. Men at the saloon doorway paused, and the general store bell gave a tired ring. She kept her veil down and spoke little. The storekeeper measured flour and asked if the shack had kept the wind out last night. She said it had. His eyebrows lifted like he knew otherwise. Behind the counter hung a crude notice. It warned that cattle had gone missing from the North Range and told folks to report stray riders or campfires on private land. Another paper mentioned surveyors from the railroad coming through next month and asked landowners to cooperate. She felt the tug of it at once. Surveyors meant money and trouble at the same time. Land like hers would rise in price if a line ever ran close. It would also be the kind of place a man with more horses and men could try to take, claiming he had papers older than hers. The storekeeper leaned in and said the ranch to the west had been trying to buy up every inch along the wash. He asked if she had thought of selling. She told him no. He nodded but did not smile. Outside, A deputy brushed dust from his badge and asked how far out she was living. When she told him, he chewed on the edge of a toothpick and said that place had a history. He did not say what that history was. He only said a drifter had claimed squat there to winter's back and lasted 1 week. There had been fires on the ridge for 3 nights, and on the 4th he had come into town with a look, like he had seen something he would not name. The drifter left on the first freight wagon east. The deputy suggested she sleep with the door barred. She thanked him and moved on. She could feel his eyes on her as she led the mule away. On the way home, the light turned long and the wind began to walk the grass in waves. She set her jaw and took the lower trail along the creek bed, where cottonwoods drew thin lines of shade. Halfway to the ridge, a shape moved under the trees. She slowed and saw the boy standing near the water, a rabbit in his hands and smoke curling from a small fire of damp twigs. He watched her with the steady patience of the land itself. She dismounted and crouched a few feet away, palms open. He spoke first. His voice was soft and careful, like each word had to cross a river before it reached his mouth. He said the bird was assigned to keep a watcher away. He said watchers left marks too. He showed her the inside of his wrist, where a thin cut had scarred white. That mark was a warning left by people who wanted him to stay hidden and quiet. She asked about the shadow at the window. He turned toward the ridge and said some men wanted this place empty. He did not say their names. He said the barn had once been used by men who trapped animals for trade, and sometimes took people too. Back when winter made stomachs hard. The symbols on the wall were put there by his kin after a circle was held near the wash to tell children not to step inside. His eyes grew distant when he said the word children. She remembered the tiny shine of the feather at his neck, and the way he never turned his back fully to her. They shared the rabbit in silence. She gave him a slice of bread and a tin cup of water. A hawk wheeled above them, tracing slow circles in the high blue. When he finally looked at her again, he said the watchers came at night, but also sometimes in the afternoon when clouds covered the sun. They moved quiet and left small things behind, so folks would doubt their own minds. A coil of wire under a window, a single stone placed on a step, a strip of cloth pinned into the dirt with a nail. He said this so calmly that she felt the ground tilt under her boots. She told him someone had nailed a rusted buckle to the barn door, and he nodded like that was proof of something he already knew. At dusk, they reached the shack together. He did not step inside. He stood near the porch posts with his chin lifted like a scout. She busied herself with the roof, driving nails into curl-back shingles. Each hammer strike steadied her a little. She did not want the boy to see her hands shake. She asked him if he had family nearby. He looked at the direction of the far hills and said he had a mother once and a sister who carried water in a blue pot. He said a trader had come through after a dry year, and the next spring everyone moved, and he was lost in the dust of it. She did not ask more. Pain had its own language. She knew not to force it. That night the wind settled. The coyotes kept their talk to the other side of the ridge, and a pale moon climbed slow. She allowed herself to imagine a quiet night. Toward midnight, from the barn, came the soft clack of wood on wood, like 2 pieces tapped together in a code. The boy slipped from his blanket and pressed his ear to the plank. After a beat, he whispered that someone was calling another. It's not with words, but with the old trail signal used by men who did not want to wake dogs. She held her lantern low and felt each second stretch until her shoulders ached. The sound moved around the barn wall, then stopped. A horse snorted somewhere among the weeds. She caught a scent of tobacco that was neither sweet nor strong, the kind riders carried when they did not want to be remembered. The boy gestured for them to stay silent. They waited until the air went thin and the horses drifted off. Only then did he breathe easy again. He said tomorrow there would be tracks. At first light they found them. 2 sets of boots, the kind cut with a high instep and narrow heel. 1 horse with shod hooves, 1 barefoot. The trail came in from the wash, circled the shack, and ended at the ridge where the ground went to rock. She felt anger rise in her chest, firm and clean, like a steel wire pulled tight. Someone wanted to frighten her into leaving. Someone who knew how to keep signs small. She thought of the notice in town about cattle missing and the talk of land near the wash, If a rancher wanted her corner, the easiest way would be to make the place feel cursed. Then she thought of the symbols in the barn and how the boy had said it had been used for taking. It could be both. The land could carry old fear and new greed at once. She decided to visit the neighbor whose fence ran far to the west. He was a quiet man who sold hay and sometimes brought eggs to town. When she reached his gate, he lifted a hand in a slow greeting and waited for her to speak first. She told him about the tracks. His eyes drifted toward the ridge and back. He said riders had been seen moving at dusk near the wash for a week. He said a small band of men had taken work under a foreman whose pay came from a larger house appriver. He did not say whose house. He said they called themselves keepers and kept no cattle. They watched lines, pulled posts, and carried coil wire on their saddles. He offered her a bundle of scrap wire and a bell. He said hang it where wind could touch. He said some watchers hated the sound. On the way home she saw the deputy riding a slow circle around the long grass just beyond her corner. He tipped his hat, asked if she had changed her mind about selling, like he already knew the question had been asked by someone else. She told him no. He said there were things a woman alone ought not face, and that the town could send a hand to help for a few days if she wanted. She thanked him, but did not accept. Pride was part of it. Another part was the boy. She would not bring a stranger into a place he used for sleep. The deputy looked past her shoulder at the shack in the barn, and his gaze lingered on the symbols cut into the slats. He said those carvings were older than many thought. He said a winter of sickness had driven families to move, and that some had not made it. He spoke the words softly with respect. Then he rode on and left a small cloud of dust floating over the grass. When she and the boy sat by the hearth that night, at O'Day, she told him about the neighbor's bell. She asked if sound could drive watchers away. He said sound could confuse them long enough for a person to see their faces. He pulled a small pouch from his blanket and took out little stones, each smooth and marked with a pale line. He placed one on the windowsill and one near the door and said they were for notice. When he set a stone beside the carved bird, he paused and looked toward the barn as if hearing something she could not. He said they could not stay here without knowing who came. They made a plan the way people do when fear refuses to let them sleep. She would stay inside with the lantern low. He would watch from the barn loft through a gap in the roof and count the steps. If the watchers came, she would ring the bell once and set the lantern on the porch to blind their eyes to the dark inside. Then they would listen for the code of wood taps. If 2 taps followed by 1 came, it meant men. If 3 close taps came, it meant a boy like him had slipped near. She asked if he knew other boys hiding along the wash. He did not answer. Silence settled in the small space between them. Before dawn, clouds rolled in from the west, thick and heavy. The day carried the taste of rain but held it back. She gathered her tools to mend the porch rail, and the boy, restless as a fawn, wandered the outer edges of the field. He returned with a strip of cloth the color of river mud. It had been tied around a stalk down by the wash and was stamped with a small broken star. He showed it to her with his eyes dark and certain. He had seen that mark before, near a camp where men wanted boys to carry water and carry silence. Her stomach turned cold. She asked how close that camp was. He used both hands to show a long way and then moved them. Closer to say, the distance had been shrinking. Late afternoon brought a visitor. A man in a tidy coat rode up the trail with a smile that did not cross the distance to his eyes. He said he represented interests upriver and had heard she owned a nice corner with good view of the wash. He said the land would treat her better if she took a fair price now and moved closer to town, where there were lamps and neighbors. He spoke of safety as if fear were a commodity he could weigh on a scale. She asked what price he called fair. He named a sum that paid for a roof and bread for half a year and then left a person empty. She told him the land was not for sale. His smile thinned. He looked at the barn a long time and said she might change her mind after a few sleepless nights. Then he tipped his hat and rode off, leaving a thin line of hoofprints that would be gone with the first rain. The boy watched the rider disappear and said that man's horse had carried wire before. He could tell by the marks on the saddle strings. He said men like that used the dark as cover, but also used the day to plant doubt. He told her the watcher sometimes worked for a foreman, and the foreman worked for a house. The house worked for a line on a map that cut through people's memories like a knife through cloth. She did not need him to explain further. She had seen the papers in the store and felt the weight of the map on her own chest. As the sky bruised toward evening, the wind shifted to the south and brought the smell of wet dirt and thunder. She hung the bell on a nail above the porch and ran a string from it to the bedpost so one pull would wake the night. The boy climbed to the loft and pressed his face near the roof gap. The first drops of rain came soft, then the second wave came harder, drumming on every plank and pail. Sound filled the air until she could hear nothing else. She feared the bell would be useless under the storm's roar. She set the lantern on the floor to keep it from being seen and sat with her back to the wall. Lightning opened the sky and showed the ridge in a white flash. In that flash, she saw movement where no man should stand in a storm. The shape was tall and still. Another flash showed a second shape nearer the barn, and for a breath, the symbols cut into the slats looked like fresh wounds. Thunder followed and shook the windows. She felt it in her bones. From the loft came a single tap, then a second, then silence. The boy had seen what she saw. She reached for the bell string and wrapped it around her hand, ready to pull. Rain hammered the roof. Somewhere out in the dark, a horse shifted and blew water from its nose. She stared at the door and tried to quiet the wild pace of her heart. The bell trembled with the weight of the storm but did not ring. She watched the knob as if it would speak. The wind dropped without warning, and the quiet that followed felt wrong. It was the kind of quiet that falls when a predator stops moving before the leap. She held the string until her fingers went numb. Then a knuckle rapped the door, gentle as a neighbor, and a voice as smooth as creek stone called to her by the name she had not given to anyone out here. It asked if she was alone and said it had come to help. The boy tapped once from the loft, sharp and quick. He had caught something in the voice she also felt, but could not name. She kept her breath slow and her hand tight around the string. The storm held its breath too, like the whole land waited to see which side of the world would claim. This shack by the wash, the voice outside the door was steady, almost friendly, yet every word carried a weight that made her chest tighten. The woman didn't answer. She kept the revolver close and her eyes fixed on the knob. The lantern dimmed behind her, casting just enough light to outline her shaking hands. The boy's signal from the loft had been clear danger. She tried to listen past the sound of the rain. All she could hear was the slow drip from the roof and her own heartbeat pressing against her ribs. The voice came again, louder this time. "Ma'am, I'm from town. You're not safe out here alone." "Open the door." Her throat went dry. The same town that had tried to buy her land now sent a man through the storm to her doorstep. "Who sent you?" she asked through the door. Silence followed. Then the faint creak of boots, shifting on wet boards. He didn't answer her question, just said, "Let me in, miss. I mean no harm." But there was something in his tone of smooth confidence that made the lie too perfect. She stayed still, barely breathing. Then the boy's whisper floated down from the loft. "He's not alone." Her heart seized. She turned her eyes toward the window, where a flash of lightning illuminated the yard. Two shapes stood near the barn, unmoving, their outlines dark against the pale light. Another figure lingered closer to the well, holding what looked like a lantern, but it didn't glow with fire. It was cold, blue light, strange against the storm's fury. The man outside knocked again, harder this time. "You have something that doesn't belong to you," he said. The words cut through the door like a blade. She gripped the revolver tighter. Her eyes darted to the carved wooden bird on the table. The boy had said it was a sign to keep the watcher away. If these men knew of it, that meant they knew of the boy too. "I don't know what you mean," she said, trying to steady her voice. "You do," the man replied. "The land. The boy. The signs on the walls. You don't belong here." Her breath caught. The floorboards above her creaked as the boy moved toward the window, careful and quiet. Another tap sounded, 2 quick strikes, then one slower. That meant more than one man, and they were moving. She raised her lantern toward the wall, the flame trembling. "If you're from town," she called out, "you'd have no trouble telling me the name of the preacher who buried my husband." The rain answered for him. Then came the scrape of metal against the door. He was testing the latch. She stepped back, gun raised, eyes flicking to the boy's shadow above. He motioned silently toward the back run, but she couldn't leave yet. Not without knowing what they wanted. The door shook once, then again, the wood groaning. Thunder rolled overhead, shaking the small shack as if the sky itself was warning them. "They'll break it," the boy hissed. "They won't stop." "Who are they?" she asked. He hesitated, eyes darting between her and the window. "Men who take what doesn't speak for itself. They come for the land, but they carry old anger too. They don't see me as a child. They see a mark that needs erasing." Her stomach turned. The shadow at the door moved again, slower this time, methodical. "Open it," the voice said, softer now, almost kind. "You can't hide him forever." The boy dropped from the loft and landed soundlessly beside her. "If we run," he whispered, "they'll follow. If we stay, they'll come in." The storm outside deepened. The bell above the porch began to sway and ring in the wind, faint, uneven. But through the storm's roar, another sound rose, a whistle, long and low. A signal, one she remembered from her husband's days driving cattle across these plains. It was the call of men closing in. She realized they weren't here for her alone. The land was the prize, but the boy was the proof of something buried. Something dangerous enough that men would risk the storm to silence it. Her hand shook, the revolver heavy. She turned to the boy. "There's a way through the barn?" He nodded behind the trough. "It leads to the creek bed." "Go," she whispered. "I'll hold them." But he didn't move. "They'll kill you." "Better me than you," she said, though the words came out softer than she meant. For the first time in months, she felt alive, again, terrified, but alive. Grief had made her numb, but fear brought her back. The door rattled violently. A voice shouted, "Break it down." She pushed the boy toward the back room. "Run when I say." Then she pulled the lantern from the table and held it high. "If you want the land," she yelled, "you'll have to come through fire to take it." The hinges screamed. The door burst open, slamming against the wall. Wind and rain flooded in, spraying the room in cold. A man stepped inside, tall, coat dark with water, eyes hidden beneath the brim of his hat. Two others followed, rifles drawn. The leader smiled faintly, like a man humoring a stubborn child. "You should have taken the offer, miss." She aimed the revolver, the hammer cocking with a click that sliced through the storm. "Take one more step," she said, "and I'll make sure you don't see morning." Behind her, the boy's small hand pressed against her back, steadying her shaking arm. She felt his presence calm, certain. "They fear the light," he whispered. "Hold it." She swung the lantern toward the men. The flame flared brighter, casting the carvings on the walls in sharp relief. The symbols, the circles and lines, seemed to shimmer, alive with sudden motion. The men froze. One of them muttered something under his breath and backed away. "What is that?" The leader barked. She didn't answer. The fire crackled higher, the symbols glowing faintly orange. The boy's eyes reflected the same light. He stepped forward, voice trembling but firm. "This place remembers," he said. "It remembers what you did." The man raised his rifle. "Shut up." Lightning split the sky, the thunder crashing so close it shook the ground. The flame leapt from the lantern, catching a curtain by the window. The woman stumbled back, clutching the revolver as fire licked the edge of the wood. The leader cursed, waving his arm. "Get the boy." She fired. The shot cracked through the storm, echoing across the plains. The man dropped his rifle, clutching his shoulder. Smoke filled the room, stinging her eyes. The boy grabbed her hand. "Now." They ran through the back door, into the rain, across the yard, toward the barn. Bullets split the air behind them. She could hear the men shouting, could hear the fire spreading. The carved bird fell from the porch, swallowed by smoke. They ducked behind the barn, panting. "The tunnel!" she gasped. The boy pulled aside the trough, revealing a narrow hole leading into the ground, half hidden by weeds. She pushed him in first, then followed, mud clinging to her dress. The storm raging above them, as they crawled through the darkness. She could hear the men outside, searching, cursing, shouting orders. Then one voice, colder than the rest, said, "Let it burn. They'll come out." She froze. Smoke drifted through the cracks in the earth, filling the air with choking heat. "We can't go back," she whispered. The boy's voice came from ahead, strained but certain. "The creek will save us." They crawled faster, the tunnel twisting, narrowing. Her hands scraped against stone. The sound of the storm above grew muffled, replaced by the faint roar of water. When they reached the opening, they tumbled into the creek bed. Soaked and gasping, the rain poured harder now, turning the dry channel into a rushing stream. The boy pulled her up. "We follow the water," he said. She looked back toward the ridge. The shack's roof glowed faintly through the rain, the fire inside flickering like a dying heart. Somewhere above, the men's shadows moved against the light. They hadn't noticed the tunnel. Not yet, the boy tugged her hand. "They'll come when the fire dies." She nodded, teeth chattering, breath uneven. "Then we don't stop." They waded through the cold water, the night alive with wind and thunder. She stumbled once, nearly falling, but the boy caught her wrist, pulling her upright with surprising strength. His grip felt like something more than human, something ancient and knowing. When they reached the bend in the creek, he stopped suddenly. "Wait," he said. His eyes darted toward the ridge again. They brought others. She followed his gaze. In the distance, through sheets of rain, torches flickered along the horizon. Men on horseback, closing in from the west. Her voice broke. "How many?" "Too many," he said softly. She swallowed hard. The cold bit at her bones, the night closing in like a fist. "Then what do we do?" The boy turned toward her, eyes shining in the dark. "You stand with me," he said, "because this land listens when someone stands." For a heartbeat, everything went still. The rain, the wind, even the thunder seemed to pause. And in that silence, she heard it. The deep, hollow sound of drums rolling across the hills, faint but real. The boy lifted his head, listening. "They're coming," he whispered. Not in fear, but with a strange calm. She didn't know who he meant, whether it was the Watchers, the men with torches, or something older that had waited beneath this soil long before any of them. But as the storm roared back to life and the glow of fire spread across the ridge, she knew one thing for certain. The fight for this land, for the boy, for her own soul had only just begun. The rain began to slow as dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky in muted shades of gray and gold. The creek had calmed into a steady trickle, its current whispering against the rocks. The woman and the boy stood at its edge, drenched and exhausted, watching the smoke rise from where the shack once stood. What had begun as a refuge had turned into ashes, yet she didn't feel the loss she expected. That place had taken her pain, her fear, and burned them away with the wood. What remained was the strange, quiet certainty that something greater had been at work. Something that had chosen her to be there when the past came knocking. The boy sat beside her, knees drawn close, eyes fixed on the horizon. His face, streaked with soot and rain, looked older than his years. "They're gone," he said softly. She looked at him, uncertain if he meant the men or the Watchers he had spoken of. "Gone where?" she asked. He hesitated before answering, his voice almost a whisper. "Back where they came from. The land takes care of its own." She didn't press him. The night had been long enough. The men who came for them were either dead, scattered, or too afraid to return. The storm had driven them into the hills, and the fire had swallowed whatever proof they hoped to take. But in her heart she knew it wasn't only fire or fear that kept them away, was something deeper. Something that had awoken when the boy stood his ground beneath the thunder. They followed the creek, downstream until the ground leveled into soft clay flats dotted with mesquite. The air smelled of rain-soaked earth and new beginnings. Birds began to call from the trees, tentative and bright. She stopped to wring out her dress and turned to the boy. "We need to find shelter," she said. He nodded, scanning the land as though he already knew where to go. "There's a canyon ahead," he said. "Water runs through it all year. My people used to live near there." They walked in silence for miles, their steps slow but steady. The woman's body ached, but every time she looked at the boy, she found strength. Something about him made the emptiness she had carried since her husband's death feel lighter. He had saved her from more than danger. He had pulled her back into life. As they reached the canyon's mouth, she saw the remains of old stone walls half buried in vines. They stopped beneath a rock ledge that offered shelter from the wind. She lit a small fire and handed him a piece of dried bread from her satchel. "How did you know the Watchers wouldn't follow us here?" she asked after a long pause. He stared into the flames. "Because this place belongs to those who remember," he said. "They only chase what forgets." The words hung in the air, simple yet heavy with meaning. She thought of all the settlers who had come west, carving out land that wasn't theirs, burying stories they didn't understand. Her husband had believed in building, in taming the land, but she now saw that it was never meant to be tamed. It only waited for those who respected its silence. She looked at the boy, wondering how many stories like his had been erased before the truth found a voice again. As the day wore on, they rested by the fire. The woman cleaned a small cut on his arm and wrapped it with a strip from her sleeve. "You can stay with me," she said quietly, "at least until you find your people again." He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, it was with a tone that felt both grateful and distant. "I'll stay until the land tells me to go." That night, the stars came out brighter than she'd seen in years. The air was clear, and the wind had softened into a gentle hum that carried the scent of cedar. She lay beside the fire, listening to the rhythmic breathing of the boy nearby. The sound soothed her. For the first time since her husband's passing, she didn't feel haunted by loneliness. She thought of how he used to talk about finding meaning in small things: a sunrise, a bird, a seed pushing through dry soil. She smiled faintly. Maybe this was what he meant. Life doesn't stop when grief begins. It just changes shape. By morning, the boy was already awake, standing at the edge of the canyon. The light made his dark hair gleam like wet stone. "They'll come again," he said without turning. She rose slowly, tightening her coat around her shoulders. "The men." He shook his head. "Not them. Others. People who want what's left. They always come, but now the land has someone to speak for it." He turned toward her then, eyes calm and steady. "You." Her breath caught. "Me. You saw what they did. You stood when you could have run. The land doesn't forget that." She didn't know what to say. The thought of herself as anything more than a woman trying to survive felt almost absurd. Yet deep inside, something shifted. The old pain that had followed her like a ghost began to ease. She had faced the storm, not just the one outside, but the one inside her heart. And she was still standing. They spent the next few days rebuilding a small shelter near the canyon, using fallen wood and stones. The work gave her purpose. The boy taught her how to listen for underground water by feeling vibrations through the soil, how to tell when the wind carried danger, and how to move without leaving tracks. In return, she taught him how to read, tracing letters in the dirt with a stick. He learned quickly, eyes bright with curiosity. One afternoon, while gathering dry brush, she found a half-burned piece of wood wedged in the roots of a tree. It was from her old shack. She recognized the carvings. The symbols were still visible, faint but intact. She carried it back to their fire and set it beside the carved bird she had saved. Together, they looked like remnants of something sacred. She realized then that both were pieces of the same story, one written in pain, the other in protection. As weeks passed, travelers began to pass through the canyon, drawn by the stream. Some were ranchers, others wanderers. They asked if she had seen the woman who once lived near the ridge. Rumors had spread about fire, trespassers, and a mysterious boy. She told them only that the land had taken back what was never theirs. Most nodded and moved on, uneasy with her calmness. A few stayed for coffee, leaving food or supplies before they left. The boy stayed quiet around them, never far from her side. Then one evening, a familiar sound reached them, the distant rumble of hooves. She stood at the edge of the canyon, heart quickening. 2 riders appeared on the ridge, but these weren't the same men from before. One wore the star of the deputy. He raised a hand in greeting. "Heard you had trouble out here," he called. "The foreman and his men didn't make it back to town. Folks say the storm got them." She nodded slowly. "The storm takes what it wants." The deputy studied her a moment, then tipped his hat. "Guess the land finally evened its debts." He looked at the boy curiously but didn't ask questions. "You staying out here for good?" "I think so," she said. "There's still work to do." He smiled faintly. "Work worth doing then." With that, he turned his horse and rode away, leaving her alone with the sound of wind and water that night. As the fire burned low, the boy sat beside her, quiet and thoughtful. "When the storm took them," he said, "it gave you something back. What's that?" She asked. "Peace," he said simply. She looked into the fire, watching the flames curl and dance. He was right. The fear was gone, replaced by a sense of belonging she hadn't felt in years. The canyon, the wind, even the silence, it all felt like part of her now. She reached for the carved bird and set it on a rock beside the fire. "Then this land and I are even," she said softly. "It gave me a reason to stay." The boy smiled, his face glowing in the firelight. "It's not done with you yet." When she woke the next morning, the air was cool and still. The boy was gone. His blanket lay folded neatly, and near the fire sat the wooden bird in a single feather tied with a strip of cloth. She looked around the canyon, calling his name. But there was no answer, only the gentle sound of water and the rustle of leaves. She stood there for a long time, holding the feather in her hand. Part of her wanted to grieve, but another part knew he wasn't lost. He had simply returned to where he belonged, just as she had. She tied the feather to a branch near the canyon wall, where the wind could reach it, and whispered a quiet thank you. Years later, travelers would pass through that canyon and speak of a woman who lived by the stream, a widow who once faced men in storms and never left. They said she guarded the land like it was her child, that she listened to the wind before every rain, and that, sometimes, when thunder rolled over the hills, a boy's laughter could still be heard echoing through the canyon. And though she never told her story again, anyone who looked into her eyes could see that the pain which once drove her to an abandoned shack had turned into something stronger, something alive. Rooted deep in the heart of the old American land she now called home,